So let's look at it. So this is the starting problem for number 8 on 232, or let's see, 313. Now the first step would be to subtract 6 from both sides. So 6n squared minus 18n, and negative 18 minus 6 is if you added it, negative 18 plus 6, you would indeed get negative 12, but we're not adding it, we are subtracting it. Or we can add it, but we're adding a negative, because negative 18 plus negative 6 or negative 18 minus 6 would give us negative 24. Now there is a greatest common factor of 6, which would give us this here. Now because the 4 is negative, our signs are opposite. The only factors of n are n and n. We would have positive 1 and negative 4. And if we did check this off to the side, n times negative 4 would be negative 4n. 1 times n is plus n, which gives us negative 3n, which is the middle term we wanted. Now, because we have two things multiplied together to equal 0, one of them must be 0. So for the first one, we would subtract 1, telling us n is negative 1. And for the other one, we would add 4, telling us n is 4. So for our 6n squared minus 18n minus 18 is equal to 6. So if we did negative 1, 6 times negative 1 squared minus 18 times negative 1, minus 18 is equal to 6. Well, our negative 1 squared would be 1. Negative 18 times negative 1 would be positive 18, minus 18. Well, 6 times 1 is 6. Negative 18 plus 18 is 0. Telling us 6 is indeed equal to 6, so it does work. We could do the same thing for 4 if we wanted to check it, and it would work out as well. So any other questions on number 8? Which one? 9 and 11 are the same thing. We just need to get them equal to 0. So number 9, 5r squared minus 44r plus 120 is equal to negative 30 plus 11r. So we need to get everything on the same side and equal to 0. So the first thing we can do is add 30 to both sides, which will tell us 5r squared minus 44r plus 150 is equal to 11r. Well, it's still not equal to 0, so we can subtract 11r from both sides, giving us 5r squared minus 55r plus 150 is equal to 0. So the first thing we had to do is get the equation equal to 0. Questions on this here? Now at this point here we can factor. There is a greatest common factor of 5, which when we factor out of each of these here, we get r squared minus 11r plus 30 is equal to 0. Now, when we find the sign, since the third term's positive, our signs are the same and they match the sign of the middle term, which is negative. So we all have negative and negative. Factors of r squared are r and r. Now we do need to find the factors of 30, which is 1 and 30, 2 and 15, 3 and 10, 4 doesn't work, but 5 and 6. And the one I'm going to pick is 5 and 6. And if we check this here, r times negative 6 would be negative 6r. Negative 5 times r is negative 5r, which gives us negative 11r, which is the middle term we wanted. Now, because we do have few things multiplied together equals 0, this is telling us that either r minus 5 is 0 or r minus 6 is 0. In the first case, we would add 5 to both sides, telling us r is 5. And in the other case, we would add 6 to both sides, telling us r is 6. And that's it. Any other questions on this one here? Or you feel good with these here? Number 11, I think, was the other one you asked. Treat it the same way as you did this one here. Get it equal to 0 and go from there. I think you'll...
At the beginning, I did do this right. I forgot.
Yes. Any other questions before we look at today's lesson? The difference of perfect squares. A squared minus b squared is equal to a plus b times a minus b. And this works for any difference when we're subtracting two perfect squares. Now the example that they gave us here is x squared minus 9 squared. And if we look at it as what's being multiplied by itself, our a and b values, here we can say x squared is, well, x times x squared. 9 squared, well, what number times itself is 9 is 3. And so for us here, a and b spot in the general form, a has been replaced with x. So in the general form where we had a, we would replace it with x, and b, for this case here, is 3, so it would be replaced with 3, giving us x plus 3 times x minus 3. Questions on this here? So if we look at this first one here, now this one is a difference of perfect squares, obviously, because that's what this whole lesson is about. We have x squared minus 25. Well, what times itself is x squared? X. Now what times itself is 25? 5. So for us, we have our a squared minus b squared, which factors to a plus b times a minus b. And for us here, a would be x and b would be 5. So when we factor this, we have a plus b and a minus b. Well, a is x and b is 5, so we'd have x plus 5 times what? X minus 5. Questions on this here? We're ready for the next one. Okay. All right. So we have 4z squared minus 1. So we need to figure out our a and b, or kind of what we're plugging into each spot. Now looking at 4z squared, what times itself would give us 4z squared? Because we would have 2, because 2 times 2 gives us 4, and our z squared would just be z, because 2z times 2z would indeed give us 4z squared, yes? Now what times itself is 1? 1, because 1 times 1 is 1. So again, kind of looking at our a squared minus b squared is a plus b times a minus b. So here, our a would be 2z plus our b would be 1. 2z plus 1. And then we'd have 2z minus 1. That's it. Questions on this here? Are you ready for the next one? X squared minus 64. So what times itself is x squared? What times itself is 64? So how would we write this out? Well, x times x plus 8 times x minus 8. Questions on this here? Are we ready for the next one? X squared minus 36. Because x squared would give us 36, and 6 squared would give us 36. And this would be what? X times x minus 6. Questions on this here? Are you ready for the next one? 100 minus m squared. Well, 100 would be, and m squared is. So how would we write this? Which one came? Which one came first? Our 10 squared, so what number is going to go first? Yep. 10 plus m and 10 minus m. Because technically we could flip the first one to m plus 10. And if we flip the second one, it would actually be negative m plus 10. Because the negative is going with m. And normally with these here, whichever one was first, goes first. Whichever one was second, goes second. Because I do see sometimes that some students would put this here as the factors of 100 minus m squared, and that's not right. What this is actually the factors for SU is m squared minus 100, because it's flipped completely. No, it is correct. It's just a lot to keep track of. Because with the difference of perfect squares, it's easy. Just whatever squared goes in the first term, second term. Because if we look at this here, what squared gives us 9n squared? So we'd have 3n and 3n. Yep, 4 squared gives us 16. Then one of the signs will be plus, one of them will be minus. Because the plus doesn't always have to go first, and the minus doesn't have to always go second. Either order works. Because we could have also said that either one of them works. They are the same thing. I don't need both. I just need one of them. Questions on this here? We feel comfortable with these. (16h squared minus 49 would be? 4h. So 4h, our sign would be? What would the sign be? Doesn't matter. Pick one. Plus times 4h minus 7. questions on this here? I think we have one more. So what would this one be? Any questions on any of this here? Do we feel comfortable with this? The difference of perfect squares is going to come back in a lot of different forms. It will continue to show back up because it is used in several different areas. Minus. How about this one here? Well, I think I'm adding 2. So I'm going to add this one in here. Yeah, because we're going to move on to that next, and those don't take more than a second. What would this one be? Is this one a difference of perfect squares? Well, we can take the square root of 50, and we get, so it's not a perfect square, and 18 is not one either. Now, is there a greatest common factor between 50 and 18? Because 2 would go into 50. If we pull it out, we're left with x squared minus 18 divided by 2 is? Now is it a difference of perfect squares? Yeah, sometimes there is a greatest common factor that we can pull out that will make it be a difference of perfect squares. It's going to be what? Because 25x squared would be 5x and 5x. 9y squared is 3y and 3y. Plus and minus. We had to factor out that greatest common factor of 2 to get there. Because without it, it is a difference of perfect squares. With that greatest common factor of 2, it does cause some errors. Let's look at one more before we move on. Let's say 36x squared minus 100 y squared. So we can say 6x minus 10y times 6x plus 10y, yes? Well, is there a greatest common factor?
Between 6 and 10? Yeah.
Or 36 and 100? 2 is 1. Because 4 goes into 36 9 times, yes? 100 divided by 4 is 25. Well, 9x squared would be 3x minus both of these are factored. This one, with the 4 factored out, is factored completely, because we factored it all the way to simplest form. But both of them are factored. And there is a difference between these two, the 36x squared minus 100y and 50x squared minus 18y. Because it might seem odd that this one here, we could factor it with the greatest common factor without it, yes? But the other one we couldn't. And the reason lies in what the greatest common factor is. Is 2 a perfect square? what times itself is 2? Well, 2 is not a perfect square. There's not something that multiplies by itself to give us 2. Is 4 a perfect square? Yeah, 2 times 2. That's why it worked with 4, because that perfect square was evenly distributed between the two parentheses, and it worked. Where 2 could not. We couldn't do that. That's why it didn't work. Well, let's move on to the last part. Use the special product pattern to evaluate 54 minus 40, or 54 squared minus 48 squared. So this is going back to our a squared minus b squared. What we've been using today is equal to a plus b times a minus b. And we can use it for this problem here because a in our case is 54, b is 48. So what we're saying is that this is the same as 54 plus 48 times 54 minus 48. So 54 plus 48 would be 102. And 54 minus 48 is 6. And 6 times 102, 2, carry the 1, 0, 1, would be 612. Questions on this one here? Are you ready for the next one? Yes? So how would we do this one here? All right, 68 plus 62, 68 minus 62. Well, what's 68 plus 62? 130. 68 minus 62 is 6. And 130 times 6 is 8, carry 1, 6. Questions on this here? So feel like we got the hang of this? Let's do one more. Let's do 36 squared minus 34 squared. Got a little bit of a head start. .36 squared minus 34 squared is 140. Yeah, I mean, it's just two numbers being subtracted from each other, yeah. But that's it. That is all we're doing for today.